The work of RISM has changed a lot since its founding, as we have already heard. As the questions asked to a musical source catalog changed over time, so did the tools and methods for describing sources. Originally, the title records were written on an index card in an international format. Today, we create detailed source description in a database, the data of which can be accessed via an OPAC or are available for further processing as linked open data. In our explanations, the focus will be on the beginnings of the RISM work in Germany, the organizational structures as well as the practical work, on one hand in the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, and in the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. The first German National Working Group was established after the first central RISM office was installed in 1952 in Paris on June the 1st of the following year. It was the second national working group after the French. The chosen seat was the Bavarian States Library in Munich, which looked like this after the war. As its music department's director, Hans Halm was also one of the founding members of RISM International and member of the Commission Mixte. And you can see him here with his successor, Kurt Dorfmüller, who was later also very important for RISM in Germany. It was on when he retired and Dorfmüller succeeded him as director of the music department. The first director of the Munich working group was Lisbeth Weinhold, who was joined by scientific assistants Helene Gensbauer, Hanna Auerbach, and since 1957, Imogen Fellinger. Interestingly, all were females at that time. In these early years, after the damages and changes caused by World War II, libraries had to be contacted and asked about their eventual musical holdings. On the other hand, many institutions not known to Aigner were now accessible. Much had changed since the times of Aigner. Many known sources had been destroyed or were relocated to Eastern Europe. In the early years of RISM, the main focus of the national working groups laid on the cataloging of musical prints, not of musical manuscripts as today. Lists of library holdings were collected and sent directly to Monsieur Lesur in Paris, who often answered with specific questions. Here I show you a very interesting discussion between Weinhold and Lesur about the catalogization of lost sources. She was advocating for this, and he was a bit doubtful. And she answers that this is very important because we never know if they might come back anytime, and she was rather prophetic, as we know today. So she wanted to include it already in this work. So can't have not much time to discuss this, but I just wanted to show how the direct correspondence between them worked in these days. The German working group, starting with the B1 series of collected prints, was responsible for the catalog entries. The Western German working group, starting with the B1 series of collected prints, was responsible for the catalog entries of German prints and of prints from other countries which were preserved as unica in German libraries. A very important work, which is not included in the printed B1 series, are the complete indexes of pieces contained in a collection, the so-called dépouillements. These lists were not meant to be published, but could be consulted by scholars who could ask when when they had specific questions to special items. Here you see two of these dépouillements, which were then written on copied and sent to the Paris office. And yes, libraries from Eastern Germany were still included in these lists, as Munich originally saw itself as an all-German office, not just for the Federal Republic of Germany. The office was at this time financed by the German Interior Ministry in Bonn and by the German Research Foundation, the DFG. In 1960, a second central office for the individual prints, Series A1, was established in Kassel, directed by Harald Heckmann, in neighborship of the Deutsches Musikgeschichtliches Archiv, which is one of these microfilm collections suggested by Hill, which was very much used by American musicologists. It didn't replace the Paris office, which was sometimes said to simplify things, but they worked jointly for several years on different projects. Paris made the B series and Kassel made the A1 series, so they had totally different tasks on different projects before the Paris office was dissolved. I pass to Andrea.
The relationship between the two country working groups was shaped by the political circumstances of the time. At first, the newly founded RISM working group in Munich regarded itself as responsible for all Germany. But when this working group asked for permission to visit the music library or Musikbibliothek in Leipzig, this was denied. The Leipzig Music Library was under the authority of the Ministry of Culture. In this way, the Ministry of Culture of the GDR learned that the RISM working group of the Federal Republic of Germany had made a promise to the Paris Central Office to record and report the printed collections of the FRG and GDR by the end of 1955. The Ministry of the GDR rejected this for reasons of preserving the sovereignty of its states. Instead, it commissioned the young musicologist Harald Kümmerling to draw up a work plan to contribute to the RISM. Harald Kümmerling submitted a memorandum in which he introduced the project and presented an initial work plan. He estimated a working time of 5 years to record all musical sources in the GDR with a staff of 2 scientific assistants and a secretary. The report was submitted to the German State Library Berlin, also Deutsche Staatsbibliothek in Berlin, which requested participation in the organization and planning of the practical work. After a meeting with representatives of the ministry, the German State Library Berlin, and Harald Kümmerling, the GDR working group was able to begin its work in the rooms of the German State Library Berlin on October 1st, 1955. In the beginning, it remained directly subordinate to the Ministry of Culture. By the end of 1955, responsibilities changed. The GDR working group worked within the framework of a research assignment of the Humboldt University Berlin under the professional supervision of the music department of the German State Library in Berlin. On January 1st, 1959, the German State Library in Berlin took over the RISM working group. With the exception of Harald Kümmerling, the staff was taken on and continued to employed as freelancers. In 1984, responsibility for RISM was transferred to the Saxon State Library, also Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Dresden, as this library had been appointed Central Library for Art and Music. In December 1955, employees from the FRG and the GDR met for a first conference. The West German working group had already been working for 2 years and had then done preparatory work for all of Germany. It made its results available for the GDR working group on a cooperative basis. The cooperation remained on good terms until the reunification of the German states in 1990. For example, copies of the title cards of the individual prints were made available to each other. This resulted in an all-German catalogue of music prints in both Berlin and Munich. In official papers and publications, however, care had to be taken to implement the political guidelines. The RISM Country-Siedlung, were also a recurring topic of discussion. In the first volume, printed collections, there was still the common abbreviation D for East and West Germany. From 1971, the two abbreviations D, BRD, and D, DDR were used. The separation into FRG and GDR, which was repeatedly demanded by Berlin, was never carried out.
Since the national working groups worked independently of the RISM central office, they could decide for themselves on the concrete form of the practical work. The German working groups began by obtaining an overview of the institutions with musical sources. In Western Germany, libraries were contacted at first with simple questionnaires about their musical holdings. I show you two random examples of these. They were very superficial, of course. They just wanted to know if they have anything, and then details were checked later. I can show the next one. This is an example where there's an annotation where it's said that at the first view there were still music manuscripts, and when they came 5 years later, this was all given by the archivists to the old paper collection people who threw it away. So there was, even after the work, many sources were lost because of people just didn't care about musical sources. This is just one of the old examples about this difficult situation in the 50s. But the working group of the GDR thought that the reliable answers to written inquiries were not to be expected, so the music collections were researched through traveling. Two important working tools were created at the time, which we still use today. The so-called Arbeitskartei, where we, of course the Dresden office, so both were, this is the so-called Arbeitskartei, which was, both working groups kept the Fundortkartei, which is a location card index, and Arbeitsjournal, which is a work journal. You see this on the left, yes. And another example from this. In the location card index, cards are filed for each location with information on address, cyclum, inventory, and cross-reference to entries in our work journal. The annual work report was entered in the work journal by the staff. The information of the institution visited and the holdings found is important for work planning up to the present. Here's an example from the Munich catalog. Decisions about practical work of cataloging were made by the Commission Mixte and spread through so-called communiques. In one of the first communiques, the Commission announced, quotation, "The catalog we are preparing is neither a scientific bibliography nor a catalog raisonné. It is mainly a dictionary of sources." Quotation end. Prints were described quite briefly with abbreviated titles and without investigations into dates of publication. As far as the title records were concerned, it was decided to make them only by autopsy, by inspection of the musical sources, never only according to old catalogs or directories. In these early years, therefore, work was mainly done on site, which meant a great deal of organizational effort, coordinating appointments with the institutions and with accommodations for both working groups. Here you see the catalog from, you see the difference. This is a manuscript card from the Berlin, from the Eastern German group, because they didn't have typewriters when they traveled to these locations, while the Western had their own travel typewriters and could write cards in the hotel rooms at that time. So this is an interesting difference between East and West. The catalog essentially followed the RISM guidelines. Author, title, publication, note, date as far as can be seen from the source, further details. In the case of prints, the decision was made in Germany to use diplomatic title reproduction contrary to the guidelines, as you can see on these very detailed title cards, which we still preserve. Lieselotte Weinhold gave a very interesting reason for this approach. A quotation, "For reasons of security, the diplomatic, which means true to the original title reproduction, was applied. It allows to become acquainted with the matter without a set of rules, which is very advantageous when employees change. It also leaves little room for individual interpretations and decisions. It sharpens the eyes for the finest details, which can be decisive for the time-related selection of the musical material to be recorded, and generally increases work discipline," which is very important for German musicologists. Quotation. In November 1965, the Commission for Libraries from the German Research Foundation hosted a meeting of librarians and musicologists on the subject of cataloging music manuscripts in Munich. Here, standards comparable to those later adopted by RISM worldwide were set. Lisbeth Weinhold reported for the Western German Working Group, quotation, "Generally, only data of prints had been so far collected, but in some cases of singular smaller libraries, music manuscripts are already included. The biggest complex in this regard is the collection of circa 1,000 music manuscripts from the Otto Beuren Monastery. In the following years, dealing with this kind of occupation will increase, but currently our working group won't be able to work with the holdings of the bigger libraries." A similar response came from Mr. Riedel from the RISM Zentralsekretariat in Kassel. A big change in this year happened when the huge collection of music manuscripts from Berlin, which was hosted in Marburg in Tübingen during wartime, was sent back to Berlin, but now to the western part of Berlin of the State's Library at the Potsdamer Platz, although they formerly belonged to the Eastern Berlin Library unter den Linden. You all know this complicated story of the Berlin sources. So the responsibility for the manuscripts in Berlin laid on the part of the Munich Working Group, not for obvious reasons at that time. We could go on and on about with the work of our two working groups, but we have to conclude this brief summary. If you have any questions or further details on our history, feel free to ask us in the discussion or at the coffee break. Thank you very much.